And joining us now here on today's program as we talk tire maintenance during a busy spring planting season, we welcome in Greg Jones, Firestone Ag Global Field Engineering Manager, is with us here today. Greg, thanks so much for taking the time to join us here on the program today. I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well. Thank you, Jesse. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Well, let's dive in. As I mentioned, a busy time of year, spring planting season. We are in the heart of things now and we are rolling along. And obviously, the biggest thing we don't want to have happen when we have a busy season and sometimes shortened windows around weather is any sort of downtime in the field. And sometimes that could happen if, say, we get a flat tire or something happens on that planter or on a tractor, whatever the case may be. So it's important to make sure that we have good tire maintenance. And I know Firestone Ag, you guys have rolled out a 7-step tire checklist, and I want to go through that. But obviously, just to kind of start to hit on what I mentioned, any downtime in the field is just it can be costly for farmers, can it, Greg?
Oh, absolutely. So here in the U.S., all the farmers are preparing to navigate the spring weather and the wet field conditions. So it's really important that they realize that tires are a critical piece of their equipment too. So going through this from the standpoint of how costly it is, yes, it's costly. It's about a little over $2,000 an hour. And how we did that calculation was we looked at the standard things like a standard 16-row planter at 30-inch rows, and then we used some industry numbers that came from the price of corn for last year, that came from USDA and the bushels per acre, and that's how we came up with that. But you could just see that $2,000 an acre could really hit the back pocket of a farmer. So it's really important that you go in and look at this from the standpoint of being proactive about your tires, because anything that delays you, Mother Nature only gives you a certain amount of time to get into the field. So you have to really be ready to go.
Definitely. Couldn't agree more, Greg. Well, let's go through this 7-step tire checklist. And I feel like some of these things are things that you would probably think are very common, but then again, we get busy and we get going. And sometimes I think maybe farmers don't necessarily remember to check these things. So I think this is a great list to kind of have in our back pocket. So walk through this with us. What are the 7 steps that farmers need to look at with their tires?
Sure. So the first step would be to check the tire pressure with a calibrated gauge. And the reason we say that is because these gauges don't stay calibrated. And when I say calibrated, I don't necessarily mean send out to a laboratory and have it calibrated, but just know something that you have nowadays cars that have TPMS on them, and you can always take your air gauge, look at your car, and see if it's measuring some pressure value, and then measure your gauge on it. And it gives you a good idea, is your gauge in calibration? That's all we're saying, because we do know that these gauges over time you need to toss them. We need to get new gauges. But checking that pressure and then looking at the inflation calculator, which is on our website, you can kind of get an idea of, okay, what pressure should I have in this implement, or what should I have in this tire to be able to carry the load. Second, you want to do an inspection, because this is a good opportunity. You got the equipment; it's idle at this moment, but it's about to be used. So take an opportunity, check the sidewalls for cracks, cuts, and damage. Now, not all things you see mean that the tire needs to be replaced or to come out of service, but it's good to note these things so that okay, there's a cut here. It's not very deep, but it could be something in the future I need to look at. So that's important. Third, you're going to check the tread and consider replacing. This is based on the wear. Okay, so you want to look at a tire and tell, is it getting down to that point where it's not going to have the traction I need? Is it not going to be able to perform like I need, just due to the age and the way it's worn? While you're there in the tread, you're also going to look at the tread. You're going to look for things like, this is the fourth thing, stubble damage. You're going to look for mainly there, do I see exposed cords? Do I see things that's going to cause the tire that's going to, it's going to need to be replaced because of those cords. Any obvious damage that you see like that, cuts, stubble, that needs to be addressed from the tread standpoint. Fifth, you're looking for the ground contact. Now, why is this important? Okay, so if you have an overinflated tire, if you get down on the ground and you can slide your hand in between the ground and the tire, that usually means you probably got it overinflated from the standpoint of you need at least about three of those lugs touching the ground. But if they're not, you can slide your hand underneath one of the three, then that probably means it's overinflated. But if you got more than three, say it's five or six, that might mean you're underinflated. So that's why we want to point that out. It's just from the standpoint of checking the contact, make sure there's gaps that are normal. Okay. Six, we got to check your valve stems because valve stems they can also crack. They're part of the mixture between it's a component. You have the tire, you have the wheel, and you have the valve stem. It's all part of the assembly. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
So the assembly is the wheel, the tire, and the valve stem. So that valve stem, you want to check it for cracks. You want to look for corrosion, and you always want to make sure it has a cap on it. Why? Because dirt, things can get down into that valve stem, and it could cause it to leak. It could cause it to also not be function properly. So you want to make sure to have a cap on it. And then those cracks, if you notice those in your valve stem, you need to replace that valve stem because that can also be a slow leak in the tire that could cause something. And you may be chasing it thinking it's the tire. It's not the tire. It's not the wheel. It's the valve stem.
Mm-hmm.
Last thing is the seventh is while you're doing all this inspection, go ahead and check the nuts because the lug nuts that you have on the wheel itself, these things when they're in use, there's a lot of vibration and these things can come loose. So we always want to go back through and just tighten, make sure everything's hand tight, nothing's loose. So that's the 7 steps that get you through this. Now, if you forget all these steps or you want your own personal copy of these steps, you can always go to our website, which is firestoneag.com. So it's Firestone, Firestone AG.com, and then you can navigate to the 7-step and you can even request your own personal copy, and they'll send you a little magnet that you can put up.
Definitely great tips there. You mentioned one thing as well in there that I think ties back into all of this also, Greg, and that is proper tire inflation and knowing your proper inflation pressure. That is so key as well, isn't it, Greg?
Absolutely, because on a lot of these planters, drawbar planters, stuff like that, they have to be probably roaded to get to where you're going, and then they need to have this pressure that you basically need for the field. So there's 2 different pressures you have to consider. If I'm going to be roading this thing or if I'm going to be working it in the field. Now the field pressure is going to be lower because you want to reduce that compaction. But to be able to transport these things, sometimes if they're all folded up, then you definitely need to consider that because you have a force that's centralized in a small area to be able to get through the narrow roads that we have. So checking the inflation pressure is very critical and understand how you're about to use the implement.
Well, again, you could find the checklist, the 7-step checklist and more online, firestoneag.com. That's firestoneag.com. With that, Greg Jones from Firestone Ag, appreciate you joining us here on the program today. Thanks so much for walking us through some tire tips, and we will hopefully talk to you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jesse.